what would we recommend for students at school? So the red box has to do with establishing routines. So until students can do this on their own, until they can be autonomous with themselves, the adults in the learning environments have to provide this for students. So that's parents at home and teachers at school. And sometimes when students are being homeschooled, it's one and the same. And during the pandemic, it was one and the same. So many of you know more about your children's processing speed skills because of the pandemic than you might have otherwise. But anyway, it's really important to establish routines. Now think about input, output, think about the student's capabilities. Is it best to establish routines and structure time and space with words because the student's highly verbal, or with a visual calendar and visual reminders because the student is highly visual spatial? So there isn't one right way for every student. We really have to think about, well, what are the student's capabilities? What will be meaningful for that student? So structuring time can be emphasizing the passage of time. So that means having a clock face as opposed to a digital clock. So an analog clock can be very helpful for many students because then they see how long they've been thinking about an answer and how much time is left to produce it. Now, that's not great for all students. I'm sure many of you parents know this, but it could make your child more anxious to see a clock. And so that might not be the best way for them. So there isn't one right way to go about this, but there are many questions to ask about whether or not it'll work. And then, of course, it can be tried. So how do we structure space? Well, we look at the area where the student is sitting, and we look at how many breaks are needed, and we look at whether a motor break is helpful between a task that has been structured into smaller, more manageable parts. So I'm sure many of you have at home established routines where your child comes in the door and puts their backpack in the same location every day. Now, this might sound like we're talking about a student with attentional issues, but students with processing speed may also have attentional issues. So clarifying the expectations for establishing routines is really helpful, even though it sounds like it might be something that we might do for a student with attentional issues. So structuring time and space to make a routine is great because the more often we do routines, the stronger students get. Remember we were talking about fluency? Now, again, some kids don't respond to routines. You're still doing the same thing that you've done for a long period of time, and you may be feeling frustrated with your child. And so what's important is just to keep scaffolding those executive functioning skills and enabling routines to one day get better, because I'm sure you all know, and I would love to see the chat when I pose this, but maybe I'll just do that. I'll pose it, and then Callie and Yael, you can tell me. But, you know, just saying hurry up or rush or go quicker, does that help? You know, thumbs up, thumbs down? No, it just doesn't work. So our getting frustrated and losing our parental cool doesn't help. So we really want our students or our children to establish routines and kind of be independent, but we're really in this for the long haul. Like I said about the car engine and the car makeup, you know, we're all going to go, let's just go back to that car analogy for a second. Let's say we're all going on a road trip. Okay, and we're all in our cars. Let's just go back to this little image here. Right here. We're all in our cars, and I'm in Los Angeles, so let's say I'm going to go up to the Northern California coast. And we're all going to get into these cars, right? So those of us with fast processing speed are going to want to gun the pedal to the metal and want to get there maybe fast, right? Or fastest or first. And others of us might want to stop along the roadside and get a snack. Maybe that's just me. Or you may be taking a little detour and looking at this little area or going to the coast along the way. So it's like things catch our interest. And we're all motivated in different ways. Some of us might be motivated to take more breaks. Some of us might be motivated to get there fast. Some of us might, you know, want to just, as I said, gun it. So there are so many issues related to motivation and interest, but we can't drive through stop signs. We have to recognize when it's time to stop and when it's time to pause, right? We don't want a speeding ticket on the way we're getting. And we might need to take a break and someone else might need to drive the car. So you kind of get where I'm going with this kind of analogy. I just kind of wanted to come back there and reiterate that when we're in a family, on a family trip in a car, we have all the different needs in the family. And that trip is going to be fun. So parents know that they're going to plan for that. And I'm thinking maybe we could do that for students who have slow processing speed during homework time. So keep that in mind for a moment. Students with slow processing speed, I'm going to go to this kind of yellow box. They need more time to transition. Now at home, that's about getting in the car. I think many of you as parents say, okay, we're going to leave in 10 minutes, we're going to leave in 5 minutes, we're going to leave in 2 minutes, we're going to leave now. That's very common. Another way to kind of help that transition is to say, look around and tell me what you need to pick up or pack. And what that requires parents is that you have all the time in the world. So I know that's not always realistic, but to whatever extent you can allow yourself to create that time, these kinds of transitions will be lovely. And I'm going to give another example. At Bridges Academy, where I consult, there's a lovely time of day between classes where there isn't a bell system. So the students are attuned to the teachers giving directions that it's time to go outside, and the teachers determine that based on the students' readiness. And then they go outside and they play or they have a snack. And then when it's time to come back into class, they look at the visual field because either the teacher or the teacher's assistant has come out, and the kids gravitate around the teacher or the teacher's assistant, and then they go enter class. But they don't enter class until they've had a conversation. The teacher greets the students. So it's a lovely, what I call a soft transition. If a student were in a traditional classroom, there would be a lot of difficulties during this time period, don't you think? So what happens at home is that we as parents are juggling a lot, and we want to rush and we want to get there or we want to do whatever. And we have to be able to remember what it's like to have this kind of a soft transition. Now, sometimes it's not possible. We just have to get there. But other times it is possible. So consider how might you make a transition at home possible. And then, being able to give the clues. Is the student going to listen to verbal prompts or visual prompts? And kind of lay things out, whether it's clothes or materials, having a drop spot, making things as easy as possible. I'll go to the next box, which is green. So this checking in for accurate perceptions. So this is a big one, and this is more related to executive functioning skills, the way I teach it. So in executive functioning skills, I'll just say that most parents are most concerned with their children being organized and meeting deadlines. But there are a lot of skills that are required before that can occur. One of the very first executive functioning skills is making sure that the student has an accurate perception of what's expected. And so accurate perceptions could be knowing the oral directions, or it could be knowing what the product might look like. But again, there's such a focus on product that we also want to make sure that we are guiding the student with the learning process. So how is the student thinking about the directions? How is the student thinking about next steps? If we ask the student how they're thinking and what they're perceiving, then we have a better sense of where that student is on the right track, and we can say, great, I like how you're thinking. Or whether the student is misperceiving or has missed a cue, and we have to provide that or reframe it. So I'm not going to talk about this for much longer, although I could, but that's a different topic on executive functioning. But if a student is expecting a very complicated written response, and the time frame isn't possible for such a complicated project, then the teacher or the parent has to reframe what's possible within that time frame. Looking to the box on the right, prompting for initiation of tasks, providing feedback for ongoing progress. Again, this is very much attuned to what students who have attentional issues need, and also students with anxiety. Sometimes students don't get started. The longer that they've talked about the instructions or the rationale for not having to do it, they could have finished the task already, right? So these are highly verbal students. Again, it's the highly verbal skills that are being shown off in this kind of negotiating. It goes back to the important intellectual environment here, where students who are really interested and engaged and motivated, they're more likely to take the prompts for processing speed and executive functioning because they're loving what they're doing and it's meaningful. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what students need to initiate a task and what kind of feedback is provided for their ongoing progress. When students hear that they're on track or that someone likes how they're thinking, it can make a huge difference. And most of the time as parents, we just want our kids to do it, and we want them to do it without our asking first. And then when they finally do it, we're silent. So we have to give as many prompts for when the students are doing what we're asking versus when they're not. So keep that in mind too. The blue box talks about the language that we can use when we're working with children. So I like to be very specific. I'm sure you've all heard this before, but we can say something like, I notice how well you're doing X, and make sure that X is very specific to the task. Don't just say you're doing a good job. Just say, I really like how you gathered your backpack before I asked you to. Or I really like how you're thinking about this answer. Or I really like that you're looking online for this. That's exactly the right place to be looking for it. So when you give specific feedback, the child gets the message that they're on the right track, but it also gives the child a sense of where support might be needed next. And that has to do with self-advocacy. Now, some students can ask about their learning needs, and other times it's the teacher or the parent that has to solve the mystery of what's really going on. And so a self-advocacy can take place when a student has self-confidence and rapport with the adults and feels that it's safe to do so. Self-advocacy is based on a student knowing what they can do well as knowing what they need support with. And an example I can give you as adults, what's something in your adult life that you could do but it would take you forever and you'd rather pay someone else to do it, or you'd rather someone else helped you out, right? You as an adult, you can choose to do that. If you have the funds, you can pay for someone to do it. What I'm saying here is that we know we could do it. We could do it well if we had 2 weeks, but we really need to do it now for whatever reasons. So how do we get over that hump of the kind of thinking that we have going on in our heads, that kind of self-talk? What we're talking about now is another executive functioning skill where students are either talking themselves towards a task or away from a task. Are the thoughts going to be self-critical? Are the thoughts going to be encouraging? So it's like kids are having this dialogue and we're not necessarily checking in with them about how they're thinking about their learning process. And if processing speed is a big issue, then what do you imagine they're thinking? This is going to take forever. I don't want to have to do this. I have to work harder than everybody else. They're going to finish before I do. And some of that may not be an accurate perception looking at the green box. It could be completely inaccurate. So we really need to be able to check in with students, whether we're the teachers or the parents, to find out how they're thinking. Because if they know their strengths, talents, and interests, then they can put in perspective their slower processing speed or their too quick processing speed, so that it's relevant for the task at hand, and that they know what to ask for, how to ask for it, and when to ask for it, which are also more executive functioning skills. So in the purple box, I was talking about content areas. I'm really talking about writing, where I've written that students should be allowed to provide bulleted answers as opposed to full sentences. Students should be allowed to dictate their answers to a scribe, whether it's a peer or an adult or a parent during homework. Students should be allowed to provide fewer items once mastery is shown. A common example of that is like every third problem in math, if it's a lot of math items. But then again, in math, which requires a written response, there should be fewer items per page, so it's not so overwhelming for a student with processing speed issues. And there should be a great deal of white space to record answers for legibility in particular. For a student with slow processing speed, I like to waive any Math Minute or math fluency assignments, because that's just making the child prove over and over again that they don't know their math facts quickly. And a use of a calculator can be very helpful. Playing games with math numbers and math facts can be fun. Again, we want learning to be joyful, but we don't want students to keep proving their disability, especially when they've got superior skills and they're twice exceptional. So waiving any timed tasks is really important at school. whether it is elementary, middle, high school. So these school recommendations are much easier to implement in elementary school. And it's much easier to allow a student in elementary school to dictate their answers. And often parents will ask me, should I allow my child to dictate? And my answer is always yes, because what's the point? Let's do the task analysis. What's the point of the assignment? Is the point that your child has to write it out and it take for, an hour and a half? Or is the point to learn what's being taught, show that learning took place? Dictation helps that student along. So I don't see it as a crutch. Once a student can write on their own, they're not going to want to dictate. Once a student can write within the time period available, they're not going to want to use a alternate way of doing things. So I trust students. I think you also trust your children. So a lot of the school recommendations here in terms of processing speed are related to transition times during the day, and they're related to written responses. And then also don't forget an oral response. Some students need to know the questions in advance so they can provide an oral response before being called on, because they need time to formulate their answer.